All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today in civics and economics, and this is going to be the Constitution. We talked about some things going on with the Constitution, and I know I'm trying to get everything nailed down, like what you haven't done and what you have done. So if you haven't done, this, yes, go ahead and jump on it. If you have done this, then I'm gonna need you to get the knowledge again. So go ahead and get you some notes, and we'll get. And if you need to hit pause, get yourself together, then let's do it. I'm going to try to put some discussion threads down. So if you have any questions or concerns or anything, just let me know, and then I'll try to answer your questions. But I will be down at off campus, and hopefully get that stuff answered. So the essential idea, and the goals, and the takeaway is pretty simple. The Constitution was created through many compromises, and it faced opposition before it was ratified. And you need to know what ratified means. Ratified means passed before people acknowledge it. That's what you had going on as well. So here's what we have. We talked about Articles of Confederation. Excuse me, I'm getting tongue tied. Delegates met and they tried to avoid public influence, so they pretty much locked themselves in a room. You see these people sitting here and they talk about different things, and then you talk about Congress ordered revisions, and you had articles, and so what you had to do, you had to talk, you had to get this thing common. When you take one document, like for example, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he let his crew look at it, his squad look at it, the first thing they said was, we need to change this and this and this and this and that. They changed about 3 or 4 different things. And so when somebody asked him, they said, so what do you think about the new Declaration of Independence? He said, man, it was a massacre. So anytime you get somebody trying to pass one thing, yes, it can be pretty detrimental. So the major framers, the major framers, you've heard of them. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. You know all these people. Okay, so I'm not going to stick on that real long. And if you have any questions or don't know, you can probably Google it. But do know that these were called our founding fathers. So we talked about the convention. The oldest delegate, the oldest delegate, and it was Benjamin Franklin, and he was smooth. He had the gift of gab. In other words, he could smooth talk a situation, de-escalate a situation quick. So, and then you have a guy named Roger Sherman. He came up with the Great Compromise, which we'll talk about that later. So, the principles of the Constitution: popular sovereignty. In other words, people could vote. People could rule themselves for the most part. Okay, and what people don't realize is we don't have a true democracy. We have a democratic republic. And the reason why is because the people vote on representatives, put in the Congress, put into the Senate, things like that, and then they come up with the electoral votes from electoral college, and they put up people that is going to run for office, presidency, for example, and then the people vote on those two to see who's going to be the president. So the people, they pretty much vote twice. All right, so people use their popular sovereignty by electing officials who represent them in government. All right, then we talk about the separation of powers. You have legislative, executive, judicial, and then they have their powers, which we'll kind of sum this up whenever if you have not already. Um, we'll sum it up whenever we sit down face to face. But so the principles of the Constitution is pretty simple. Number one, you talk about the branches of government. That's from a guy named Baron D. Montesquieu. He came with the idea of the checks and balances. And then, with the Constitution, they wanted individual rights. However, it had a limited government. In other words, the central government had limited powers, and it was divvied down to the states' rights. And this became an issue, which led to the Civil War. We'll talk about that later. So the principle of the Constitution, you had federalism. Federalism is, and we'll look at federalism, but that's basically just an idea that the central government has a lot of power. And then, if you see right at the bottom, this tension will be a factor causing the Civil War, which is federalism, among other things. But when you hear people, the first thing they say is what caused the Civil War. First thing everybody defaults to was slavery. Slavery was an issue, but it was not the issue when it came down when it came to the Civil War. So what you see right here is a graphic, which is called a Venn diagram. and it shows you some powers that they share and some powers that stand alone between the states and the or the national government or federal government. So the big thing is conflict and compromise. How do we handle our conflicts and how do we handle our compromises? Not when people compromise, that doesn't always mean that everything is great. That just means that we agree. But then sometimes with compromises, people start harboring feelings. So you had a thing on the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now, here are the differences. Virginia plan, Virginia plan calls state representation in Congress and based on population and things of that nature. However, New Jersey was like, nah, it needs representation in Congress to be equal for all states. And the reason why is because if you look at the layout or the public lines or the state lines between New Jersey and Virginia, then you look at those two and you would know that Virginia would probably have more delegates in New Jersey based on population. All right. So the New Jersey plan favored the smaller states. So they had to compromise on that. And then you have the Great Compromise, which was also called the Connecticut Compromise because Connecticut was one of the smallest states and still is pretty small to this day. But it wanted a two-house legislature. Okay. And it's two-house legislature. You had the House Representatives and the House Representatives. And then you had a state Senate. And each state had two representatives equal. So it pushed for equality. No matter how big or small, you could be California, or you could be Connecticut. You're still going to have two elected to the Senate. Now, the issue. We have an issue. And the issue with the northern states, they did not want slaves to count. They didn't want slaves to count. And here's the thing. The North had this thing in their pocket saying, well, because you think about it in the Southern part, as far as this time, the slaves outnumbered these colonizers, as I'll call them, like 10-1. So because it was sparsely populated, because of the layout of the South and the plantations, things of that nature. So therefore, the South wanted them to count because they were like, wait a minute. If you got a concentrated population up in the Northeast, and we hardly have any white people in the South because the slave population was so huge, then therefore they would be technically outnumbered. So that's why they come up with the 3/5 compromise, and the compromise says that individuals are 3/5 of the population. The reason why they're not count whole because if they count whole, then they have to have the Bill of Rights, the basic rights of man. However, the Bill of Rights does not apply to Native Americans or African Americans at that point in time in history. That's why the 3/5 compromise, because every black person counts 3/5 of a person, which would put more delegates in the House of Representatives. That's basically what I just talked about. Now, the impact is this. Southern states have bloated the power in Congress because of the 3/5 compromise, and that's when the tension of slavery starts kind of taking effect. Now, the big question is, will it pass? Will it pass? Obviously, announced that 9 of the 13 states had to agree for the Constitution to pass. All right, the Congress articles is too weak to stop itself from being replaced. And actually, some of the smaller states, their delegates just decided to protest and they did not show. So you have Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which you've already talked about. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I don't want, too many things, too much time taken off. But it was a question of who. It was a question of government power, and it was the Bill of Rights and who does it apply to. And people don't realize that the Constitution was not at first was not intentional toward everyone. It was only at that population of European people. Pretty much what I talked about a second ago. So the Federalists pushed the Constitution, obviously, because it was stronger leaders like George Washington, people of that nature, and it was better organized, more control of the press, and also published the Federalist Papers, a series of essays that argue their case. What the Federalist Papers are. But anyway, So you look at this situation. It was more control of the press. Any country right now that has control of the, or even back after this, had control of the press, was deemed a dictatorship or totalitarian type government. And we were trying to keep the idea of being a democratic republic. So here's what the Federalist Papers are, and it pretty much, said that the republic, was the best form of government. Excuse me, getting tongue tied. And the republics use elected officials, representatives to make laws. That was a big part of it. Now, and explained the need for checks and balances based on Baron de Montesquieu, and argued the separation of powers, and said that limiting government, this is the way to protect people's rights. So what you have, like I told you a minute ago, you had, and I'll try to link some more things, but it talked about you had three types of government. And then you had debates on ratification. Ratification continued all throughout the colonies. And that is pretty much the end of that. I'll try to put some discussion things up. If you have any questions, please let me know.